So if I haven't met you before, I'm Rebecca, probably here, best known as Phil's wife, and I don't get here as often as I can, but I'm actually going to be around a little bit on and off the next couple of months. And I said, what about I preach? This was like last Sunday, so we were coming back from holidays, thinking, maybe I'll just pull out something I've done before and rework it specifically for today. And he goes, yeah, that'd be great. Then on Monday morning he says, by the way, I've just emailed you the preaching roster. You're preaching on Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. I'm like, okay, I'll be a good area officer and say yes. If it was just the wife, I might have said no, but I did that. And you know what? This week I've enjoyed preparing this message. I think God wanted me to prepare and to hear and to learn and to grow through this verse as well. So what a gift it is to be told by your husband what to do is the summary. I'm just joking about that bit, but yes, it has been really enjoyable this week. So challenging, don't get me wrong. God doesn't always, pat you on the back and say you're doing a good job. Sometimes it challenges your spirit. So I'm praying that will be the case for you as well. And I know that you've been looking at these Beatitudes, this beginning part of the Sermon on the Mount for the last 3 weeks, and this is the 4th week, so I'm jumping in part of the way through. But these verses are talking about what the family of God should look like. So I think, do you have slides? Yeah. So I think there should be a photo come up. So anyone know who this is? Anyone that stalks me or Phil on Facebook or who's been here before? Anyone know who this is? This is my son. This is my son, Brad. He's 22. That was a few months ago now when he bought his first proper car. Who do you reckon he looks like? Phil. Everybody says, you look like your dad. And in fact, Phil and I got married when Phil was about 19, almost 20. So he was a couple of years younger than this, and I even think he looked so much like Brad looks up there. Brad doesn't have to do anything. Anyway, we were having family dinner a couple of weeks ago. We were in Sydney on our holidays for a week, and we met his new girlfriend. I don't know if that's supposed to be public. He's put it on Facebook. It must be out there. We met his new girlfriend and talked, and he's like, it's just really annoying because even she has said that I look like my dad. Like, even she says that. So put up the next photo. I think that's a picture of, see, they're very, very similar, right? Really similar. Now, Brad doesn't have to do anything to look like Phil. Right? It's just the way he was born. It's just the DNA, the genetics. But you know what? Brad actually is a lot more personality-wise like me. He's kind of like smart like Phil, engineering, physics, kind of maths brain. But in his day-to-day life, the way he plans things, he's disciplined, he's organised, overthinks things, that kind of thing. He's very much like me. So isn't it interesting that this kid, it's not really interesting, you've probably been to see a new baby and you think, who do they look like? Or who are they going to be like? Are they going to be like their mum or their dad? And really what we're talking about at the moment is what it's like, or what the children of God are like. What characteristics do they display? How are they like Jesus? How are they like God the Father who gave Jesus for us? And in some ways, we don't have to do anything to look like our parents. Brad would probably choose not to look exactly like Phil. He always says, I don't like his nose. Well, I don't think it's that bad, but that's what he says. But in this Beatitudes we're looking at, these words from Jesus, they describe who we are, what we've been given, our rights, if you like, as Jesus' family, the kind of posture we need to have. He's not talking about our Myers-Briggs, our personality type. We're all going to be a little bit different in that regards, right? But in the sense of DNA, like who are we? Not our temperament, but who are we? What do we value? What attributes do we display to the world? So these Beatitudes, it's not 8 different types of people. Like some people are meek, and some people are peacemakers, and some people hunger and thirst for righteousness. Actually, as the children of God, these are the characteristics, all 8 of them, that God is working in us and encourages us to pursue in turn. Those of us who are part of God's family, these are the characteristics of God. Jesus is describing life in his kingdom. This is what it's supposed to look like if you're mine. If you live near to me, if you're part of my family, this is what you will look like. You've all seen those pictures that say that your dogs start to look like you, or that, wives start to look like their husbands, even though there is no DNA. I don't know how true all that is, but it's certainly true that the longer we journey with Jesus, the closer we get to Jesus, the more we hunger and thirst for Jesus, the more like him we become. So you can see We're up to the fourth Beatitude. That was just a bit of an introduction to the Beatitudes. But it's a bit of a turning point in the Beatitudes. There's sort of an order happened. The first three are a bit passive, if you like. Blessed are the poor in spirit, like really important. I'm not saying passive as in not important, but things that it's more of our disposition. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Each of these three acknowledging really an emptying of self, our dependence on God, our need for God, acknowledgement of a desperation, an expression of our need. But this fourth Beatitude, it's a bit of a turning point. It sort of stands a bit at the heart of the Beatitudes, this halfway point, if you like. In fact, I read a commentator this week, Martin Lloyd-Jones, and he said this week about this Beatitude, he says, it's the statement to which the first three lead. You know, so when we empty ourselves, when we're meek, when we acknowledge our need for God, we actually then direct ourselves, or God directs us in this point. The fourth Beatitude tells us how God will meet us, that he will fill us, that he will satisfy us. So the first three, if you like, are about our disposition or what sort of things that people will see in us. And this fourth one speaks about what we're driven towards. You know, when we become like Jesus, when these things are growing in us, actually we're then going to turn and our lives are going to be driven towards something really different. So I'm going to read it because I haven't actually read the verse yet. Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Now I want to say that, like many biblical metaphors, this hunger and thirst is a metaphor that doesn't really resonate today as strongly as it does in Jesus' day, when food and water were scarce and people were often hungry and thirsty. Because let's be real, as much as our kids tell us all the time when it's been 5 minutes since their last meal, I'm hungry or I'm thirsty, the reality is for most of us, not for everybody, but for most of us in our world, in Australia, there's very few of us that have experienced significant hunger and thirst. Or at least it's not that hard to be fed or to be unthirsted. What's the word? Drunk? Like, to stop our thirst. I don't know what the word is. In our culture, food and water are quite plentiful. So we miss this urgency, this extremeness that Jesus is talking about. When I'm hungry, and sometimes this leads to me being hangry. You've heard that phrase before, when you're hungry and you start to get irritable, like maybe a little bit angry. It's like you're hangry. My kids will say that to me sometimes when I'm a bit flustered and struggling to make a decision. They'll say, Mum, do you need to go to the bathroom or are you just hangry? You know, they know it's something like that. Like, you know, it's just not right. But I can quickly pop into a grocery store, or I can drive through McDonald's, or more often than not, go to the cupboard or fridge at home and find a snack. It's relatively easy for me to fix my hunger and thirst. That's the reality. To hunger in our world often means waiting an extra 10 minutes for the rolls to come out of the oven, or waiting an extra 15 minutes for the preacher to finish so you can go home and get some lunch. You know, even if you haven't had breakfast this morning, your stomach might be churning a little bit, but you're really not desperately in need of food right this moment. In fact, for most of us, for me included, I'll speak for myself, my problem isn't finding something to eat. It's losing the fat that comes from eating too much, right? That's the reality. But the people that Jesus addressed, they knew what it meant to be hungry and thirsty. In that region, few were prosperous, and more likely at one time or another, these listeners, they had experienced the kind of hunger that Jesus was referring to here. You know, they lived in poverty, many of them. No grocery stores, no refrigerators, no running water. And so they may have gone days without food. They were all well acquainted with hunger pains. And in Jesus' day, when you were hungry and thirsty, it took action. You had to actually reorientate yourself to work hard urgently to gain food. Something needed to be done. You needed to walk to the well to get something to drink. You needed to go out and work the fields to get something to eat. Their whole life, their whole direction would change. The plans for the day would change in order to satisfy their hunger and their thirst. So Jesus uses the metaphors of eating and drinking as the motivating power to live a righteous life, this deep sense that something's got to change. Because you see, you've got to want it. That's what Jesus is saying about righteousness. You've got to want it. No one can force you to eat. You've all mainly probably all heard that phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. No one can force you to eat. You tried with a toddler trying to get them to eat. It's hard work. You can't really force it. You can encourage it, you can try to force it, but really they have to want to eat. And like food, you've got to want to live a righteous life. That's the reality. This verb that Jesus uses for hunger and thirst, it means an intense desire, an ardent craving, an all-consuming pursuit. Nancy said it, not Nancy, sorry, I think it was Laura. Was it Laura who read the prayer? That sense that everything else grows strangely dim because your pursuit is so focused on Jesus. That's what it is. It's as though you are parched and nothing will stop you from getting to the water fountain to drink, or so hungry that you'll pursue food at all costs. It's a desperate kind of hunger. Do we have that? Now, I was about to say I like to run. I like to be able to run, so I do run. I don't really love it at the time. I love it afterwards. And I've got a standard path that I've run most of the time since we moved here in January. And it's basically down Merri Creek. I run 2.5 kilometres away from my house down towards the city, I suppose you'd say, and 2.5 kilometres back. I've done it for ages. It's fairly flat, only a few little inclines, not too bad. But about 3 months ago, I got COVID. And then I just seemed to always be thirsty when I was running. So I used to stop. I never used to years ago, but more recently I used to stop at the 2 kilometre mark. There's a bubbler there. And I stop and I drink at that bubbler, and then I run my extra 500 metres and I run back and I stop again at the bubbler. And it seems to get me through. But soon after I started doing this, the bubbler broke. You know, one time I went there and it had this like red and white tape over it. Anyway, so I died on the way home. I got home to Phil. I'm like, oh, that bubbler better get fixed soon. Like, you know, and he's like, how long's it been broken? I'm like, oh, maybe 3 days. He goes, I'll give it a few months. I'm like, no, like the councils are better down at in Melbourne, right? Everything gets fixed straight away. Well, you know what? A couple of months later, it's still not fixed. But you know what I've done the last month or so? I can't do it. I can't run without my route. Like I have changed my running route and I run the other way up near Coburg Lake, and it's got this hill. Like I'm running up a hill that I didn't even want to run up. I've changed my entire direction because I need that water. I need the water that's on the way, right? Other times I've actually gone up and run on the upfield. If you run up there or you've been up there on the bike, because it's got water every about like 700, 800 metres. So it's like I know my thirst can be quenched there. But I changed my whole direction because I'm so desperate for that water. I was thinking about that this week as I was running for the bubbler and I was preparing this message, and that's exactly the feeling that we should have about God, His righteousness, His kingdom, that desperation to want to be like Him. Hunger and thirst are intense desires. It's that insane intensity Jesus is saying that we need in seeking righteousness. Listen to the psalmist again. We've heard the words already in a song and from Pam this morning. Psalm 42, as the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, God. I thirst for God, the living God. When can I come and appear before God? In Psalm 63 verse 1, God, you are my God. I eagerly seek you. I thirst for you. My body faints for you in a land that is dry, desolate, and without water. So we need to want it, but we also need to take action. Appetites aren't filled until you do something about it. It's like when Phil sits on the couch at night and says, I'm hungry, and I'm like, there's food in the fridge, and he stays with his laptop on his lap and says, oh, I'm really hungry. I'm like, you're going to have to get up. I don't know if he's thinking that I should get him something to eat. That's not generally how it happens in our house. So, but like, you've got to actually get up and do something to fill your hunger and thirst, right? You need to do something about it. And as much as God is the one who fills us, we're the ones that need to run to Him, to come to Him, to take action. Jesus says in John chapter 6, verse 35 and then 51, I'm going to read both these verses together. I am the bread of life. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry. No one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. I am the bread of life. We get to go to the source of life itself, Jesus, to quench our thirst, to fill our hunger. St. Augustine, many, many centuries ago, he was onto something. He said this, "O God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. You've been through seasons, and maybe you're going through one now where that's how you feel. That's a little bit restless. Maybe it's God's prompt in you. Actually, you need to go back to the source. That's find rest. Go back to Jesus. In Isaiah 55, verse 2, the prophet says this, he's speaking the words of God. He says, "Why do you spend your money on junk food?" Maybe God's talking to me. "Why do you spend your money on junk food, your hard-earned cash on cotton candy? Listen to me, listen well. Eat only the best. Fill yourself with the finest." You know, the prophet Isaiah, God was aware that people then were looking for satisfaction in all the wrong places. We don't know about that in our world, do we? They were trying to satisfy the cravings of their heart with the junk, if you like, of this world, of things that promised to fill their hungers. Maybe they were trying to find satisfaction even in the church, which is not where God says our satisfaction should be found. Everyone has a spiritual appetite, and we're not looking for things that are on the surface. Jesus says that we need to find our hope, our strength, our source, our satisfaction in him. Money, power, beauty, professional success, organised religion, none of them provide what we actually need. What we need to pursue is Jesus himself. And some of those things, like the church, hopefully, are helpful in that process of pursuing Jesus himself, but don't let it get in the way. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Jesus says, "I am worthy of your investment." So that's a little bit about the first part, hungering and thirsting. I want to take a moment to make sure we understand what righteousness is, what righteousness was that Jesus has in his view when he's talking about this. So you see, Jesus is teaching us that it's normal to have longings, right? It's normal to need something. It's normal to have desires. And Jesus recognises that the push towards us wanting to find satisfaction, wanting to find purpose, that it's actually just part of how we've been made. It's human nature. It's a good thing. It doesn't need to be stamped out. In fact, it can't. But it does need to be channelled in the right direction. It needs to be channeled. It needs to be redirected. Jesus says, "Here is righteousness. Righteousness is found in me." If you look up a biblical definition in like a Bible dictionary, righteousness means a life pleasing to God, a life in right standing with God. So Jesus does say, do you hunger and thirst for a life pleasing to me? A life that lines up with what we as a family of God are about. Paul tells us none are righteous, not even one. And how do you know you're righteous before God? You can't buy it, you can't bargain for it, you can't pay for it, you can't produce it. What makes you right before God? And I'm sure you would have heard, if you've listened to Phil preach, I'm sure every single time he preaches, he'll tell you can't earn your own grace, you can't earn your own salvation, it comes from God. It's a gift from God. We're declared righteous not by virtue of the fact that we are righteous, but by virtue of the fact that Jesus is righteous and all he's accomplished for us. His work, his performance, his merit. So in effect, we're positionally righteous, right? We're right before God because of what Jesus has done. And so in effect, in some ways we could say, blessed are all those who hunger and thirst to be righteous, to be right with God, for they will be satisfied in and through what Jesus has done. And that's true. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, yes, that's the crux of what it means to be saved. You need to accept what I've done for you. But here in these couple of chapters, he goes on, especially in this chapter, Matthew chapter 5, he goes on to describe the personal righteousness of disciples. He goes on to say, so if you're living with me, this is what it looks like. This is what your righteousness is going to look like. This is what it's going to display. And so I want you to hunger for these things. I want you to hunger to be like that, to be like me. He describes the personal righteousness of disciples who put aside murder, angry, adultery, who give to their oppressors, who love their enemies. We see that later on in verses 22 to 48. He also says that thirsty, hungry disciples pursue mercy, purity and peacemaking, which you're going to look at the next few weeks in the Beatitude. All really important. So in Scripture, righteousness has several aspects. There's the personal righteousness we're given, but we're also to pursue it. We get it and we pursue it to be more like Jesus. But also we see Jesus talk about the fact that we need to long for a social righteousness, for God's cleansing and healing of society. Hunger for righteousness leads us to want to promote God's cause in business, education, politics, in our community. You see, God's righteousness includes his justice. In English, I'm not going to give you any Greek and Hebrew words today, but I want to tell you, in English, the words for righteousness and justice are different, right? They sound like very different words. They don't have the same beginnings or endings. They sound like very different words. But both in the Hebrew Old Testament, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, so both in the Hebrew and in the Greek New Testament, there's only one word group which refers to both. They both come from the same word. God's justice and his righteousness are basically the same thing, or at least they're very connected. They go together. You can't have one without the other, as they say. So the Beatitudes tell us that the kingdom of God comes to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, both a personal, like holiness, pursuing of godliness, but also a social justice. Hear what that means. We can't just be satisfied if we feel like we're good with God and the world around us is crumbling. We continue to hunger and thirst for God's justice in every sphere of our world. This vision of righteousness that Jesus has, that he talks about in this Sermon on the Mount, it brings about the healing and renewal of our whole world that we so desperately need. God's justice in every sphere of our world. And God promises that those who truly hunger and thirst will be filled, nothing more. My prayer for my life, for this church, for the Salvation Army, is that we continue to read the Gospels of Jesus. We continue to learn about what it means to be his disciples. We continue to guard our appetites and cultivate a hunger for the things of God, and we commit to allow a right response to what we see, to what God puts in front of us in our world. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. They will be filled. The world will be different because of who they are. Finally, this morning, I want us to have a look at this verse one more time and to pay attention to the tense, like to when it happened. One of my daughters, Chloe, is doing an education degree, and she gets me to read through her, to proofread after she's written an essay, and I was doing one last night. And a lot of the time she has, lesson plans, draft lesson plans. And I was reading one last night, and she just kept on getting the tense mixed up, as in one moment she was talking about the students have done or are doing, and later it's will do, I'm like, you just got to be consistent. Are you writing a plan that's happening in the future or that's happened or whatever? It needs to be consistent throughout. So I'm all about the tense. And when I read these verses this week, or this verse this week, I really was drawn to the fact of the tense of this verse, especially for some of us that have been a Christian and looking at this verse for a long time. Jesus tells us the ones who are blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. In other words, the blessed ones aren't those who think they have righteousness already, but those who feel like they lack righteousness. Here's what it feels like to be a follower of Jesus. You don't feel like you've arrived. You continue to feel unsatisfied because the world is not yet a just place to live. If you think you're right with God and suddenly everything feels good and happy and full and content, I'm sorry, that's not really what faith is about. It's not that we once upon a time hungered or once upon a time in the past were thirsty. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who hungered and thirsted for righteousness and so got it. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, current tense, for righteousness, for they will be filled. For God's right, when you hunger and thirst for God's right, for your life and for our world, you will be filled, but you will continue to hunger and thirst. You'll wake up the next morning, as we do in real physical life, and need more food, need more of God. We never have arrived. So we can't just be satisfied because we think we're right and we've got it together. although I think these days no one really feels like they've got it together anymore. We don't really know what's happening, do we? But we continue to hunger and thirst for God's righteousness while the world's not right, while we continue to see wrong, we continue to see injustice. And aren't we as a Salvation Army founded on that? William Booth was hungering and thirsting for righteousness when he says, I'll fight. He said, while things aren't right with the world, I'll fight. I'll hunger and thirst for righteousness. While women weep, while children go hungry, while there's still one dark soul, you know his famous speech, I'll fight. I'll hunger and thirst to make the world the right place, because that's what it's like to be a child of God, part of the kingdom of heaven. And it starts and it continues by coming to Jesus himself, the source of life itself. We're going to sing a song that really is a prayer. Jason's going to help us. And when Jesus says, you will be filled, he means you'll be filled by Jesus himself. And then we'll be able to represent Jesus' righteousness in a world that so desperately needs it. And so maybe these words are your prayer. We're going to reflect on these words that say, we need a fresh wind. The fragrance of heaven. Have you ever thought about what that phrase means? The fragrance of heaven. It really means, like the Lord's Prayer says, we want it to be on earth like it is in heaven. You know, we want to smell a bit of heaven. We want to see God's righteousness here on earth as it is in heaven. Is that your prayer? We ask God, pour his Spirit out. Pour his Spirit out. For hearts that burn with holy fear, purified in faith and deed, refiner's fire, strengthen what remains. So we, the church who bear your light, lamp aflame, city bright, King and kingdom come is what we pray. My prayer is that you will continue to pray that God's kingdom will come, that you won't be satisfied with just whatever is the status quo around you, that you'll continue to hunger and thirst for God's kingdom to come here on earth as it is in heaven. So let's pray. If you want to come and kneel and ask God to do a new work in your life, to ask him to all that hunger and thirst that you have this morning, there's time for that too. If you'd like to stay in your seats and just listen to Jason sing, you can do that. Sing along. Just respond as God leads you this morning.